Hello and welcome. I'm Erin Dowdy, the Because of Her Story Internship Coordinator for the American Women's History Initiative at the Smithsonian. After an incredibly successful and engaging week one, I'm delighted that you're joining us for week two of the American Women of Science Recovering History, Defining the Future virtual symposium. Today's sessions will focus on women's scientific achievements from the past and present in such areas as space exploration, the Arctic and Antarctica, and the Chesapeake Bay. Before we begin the symposium, here are a few details about how this will work. First, we are recording this session, and the recording will be made available afterwards via our website, womenshistory.si.edu. We are also offering live closed captioning of this event, which you can enable on the bottom bar. This program is being conducted in listen and view only mode, which means your microphone is muted and camera is disabled. And now I am excited to introduce today's first panel, Reach Across the Stars. Interactive AR app showcases women in science with innovative technology, featuring Dr. Kim Arkan, visualization scientist and emerging tech lead at the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory, Christina Hernandez, aerospace engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and Sasha Samoshina, deputy manager of the Ops Lab at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's really wonderful to be here, and we're very excited to be able to talk to you about what we've been up to and share some of our thoughts about issues facing women in STEM today. Sasha will be doing the moderation today, but I think I'm just going to jump right in and just give a very brief introduction on my own role. I've actually worked for the Smithsonian for about 22 years, so it's been a while, and it's been a really incredible opportunity, I think, to work at the intersection of Smithsonian culture and talent and also NASA data. So as mentioned, I'm a visualization scientist for NASA's Chandrax Observatory, which means essentially I get to take data of the universe and turn it into something, hopefully something cool. My work sort of emphasizes working with like 3D data. So taking 3D models and being able to work with them in various formats in virtual reality or some other form of extended reality like holograms, or bring them into augmented reality for an app that we'll talk about very briefly. And even do 3D printing and data sonification. So the app that we would just like to mention again, very briefly, is Reach Across the Stars. And very excitedly, we were just notified that Apple selected it as the app of the day, which will be, I think it's on Friday, that it'll be appearing in the App Store. So the timing of this session is actually really great so that we can announce that. But the app was supported by the American Women's History Initiative at the Smithsonian and also by NASA's Chandrax Observatory. And essentially it takes you behind the scenes to a number of women in STEM and science, technology, engineering, and math, so that we can sort of get a glimpse, an interactive glimpse of the type of work they get to do. So for example, we talk about past women like astronaut Sally Ride and mathematician Katherine Johnson, as well as present women like astronaut Mae Jemison and astronomer and computer scientist Wanda Diaz. The whole point is to bring augmented reality into the application though, which is a free app, so that you can use your phone or your iPad or what have you to be able to immerse yourself in their work environments or in their science data. So you can explore Mars, for example, the surface of Mars in a 3D format, and you can take a tour of NASA's space shuttle, and you can listen to data of an exploded star, and you can spin around a pulsar and learn about the parts of it. And I'm very excited that our next episode is actually launching in a couple weeks, and that will include segments on a tour of the International Space Station and also astronaut training. So with that, I'll toss it over to Sasha.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kim. I've had the wonderful pleasure of working with Kim on that project, and it's been a great delight. So my name is Sasha Samoshin, as was mentioned. I work I'm a software systems engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, focusing really on extended reality, mixed reality, and how to engage audiences in interactive ways. So my lab focuses on software innovation, and we make a lot of augmented reality applications with actual data from Mars, as well as data from other planets that we're studying, and as well as engineering data. So really thinking about creative ways to help solve problems for both engineers and scientists to be able to interact with their data in a new way. So it's a very exciting world, but it's also a world in which we still use web applications as well. So, we really kind of thrive in this place that software exists. And speaking of Mars, I think I'm going to pass it right over to Christina Hernandez, who has a very exciting job and also works at JPL, but in a different way. So I'm going to throw it right over to you, Christina.
Yay! Well, I'm so happy to be here. So Christina Hernandez, my pronouns are she and her and hers, and I work on the Perseverance mission. So actually, in between this event, I am getting to operate our instrument that's in cruise flight on its way to Mars. And at the same time, we're planning the very real activities that science and engineers are going to be able to do once we get to Mars. So super exciting, super busy time. But by trade, I'm a payload systems engineer. And so that's just a fancy title for somebody who gets to tinker and troubleshoot, even cause trouble by testing the interactions between software and hardware on our different science instruments, which is kind of what I focus on. So it's been a very wonderful role. And again, being able to see the intersectionalities of different roles and people coming together to make this very complex beast of a thing known as our lovely Perseverance rover. So I'm really excited to kind of talk about my role here today and just all the different work that a lot of great women are doing on the project as well.
So just to dive in a little bit for those that might not know about 2020 and the Perseverance rover, can you tell us where it is now, when it's landing, and maybe a little bit about what your part on it was for the instruments that you worked on?
Yeah, absolutely. So fun fact, we're actually halfway there distance-wise. So we launched, a few months ago, and we'll be landing February 18th. So stay tuned. We'll have a ton of events so you can listen into it. But we'll be landing on Jezero Crater on Mars. And what's really exciting about Jezero is that it's home of an ancient lake and delta. And so one of the things that we'll be doing on this mission is collecting samples for the first time to bring them back on a future mission. And so that has, all scientists and science geeks, myself included, super excited to figure out, what are we going to collect? What are we going to find? And more importantly, when do we get to bring them back? And so my job on Perseverance, as I mentioned, was getting the science tools or the toolkit of the rover ready. And so that was working on 3 out of the 7 different science instruments that are from, JPL all around the US and around the globe, get them ready, designed, built, tested, and eventually operating on Mars. And so I got to work on a slew of different complex acronym sounding instruments. So 2 of my first ones were META and RIMFAX, and it was really great because they're international collaborations. And so I got to travel to Spain and Norway to meet the teams, get introduced to the cultures over there and the people behind the instrument. And then I'm also working on Pixel, which is a JPL instrument. It's an X-ray spectrometer. And I think aside from the amazing complexities of the instrument itself, Pixel is actually led by the first woman to lead a scientific instrument investigation to Mars, Abigail Allwood. And Abby is amazing, right? She's from Australia. She's done all kinds of great research on stromatolites and how to look for signs of ancient life looking really, really up close, which is exactly what Pixel's going to do. And so these instruments are all over the rover. And what we're really excited is to use those instruments together as one team to help bring back samples on a future mission and just help us understand, the ancient past of Mars.
It's really exciting, and I should mention briefly that Christina is also featured in the Reach Across the Stars app. So if you want to explore the Perseverance rover, you can do that with a little bit of backstory from Christina as well. So that's really something I wanted to mention. So okay, data collection, Kim, I think we should talk a little bit about how you do your work. You know, you mentioned that you do 3D visualizations. How do those work? I mean, I know you do some actual 3D printing of things as well. Can you kind of dive into where the data comes from, and then how you actually make it become sometimes a physical thing?
Yeah, sure. It's actually one of my favorite things to do. And I never expected that I would have so much fun working with the data in that way. But NASA's Chandrax Observatory, just to step back for a quick second, is a telescope that has been operating in space. It goes about a third of the way to the moon for over 20 years. And that's an incredible feat when you think about it. And I think what made it even more special is I joined the mission right before launch. So about a year before launch, and got to really see all of the intense work and faith that was put into this massive piece of equipment the size of a school bus. Since it was so large, it was actually the largest payload for the space shuttle. So when it was launched by the crew and everyone on the ground, it was a bit of a dangerous mission. And Eileen Collins at the time, she was the commander of the mission, and she was the first woman to command a NASA space shuttle mission. But she had done all the training, and she had such faith in all of her own training and all of the support people on the ground and her fellow astronauts that, you know, when asked about dealing with a mission that was pretty extraordinary, she was so calm about it. And I've always found that perspective really refreshing. And another really important person in the astronaut crew, not that they weren't all important, but another one that I have become friendly with over the years is astronaut Katie Coleman. And she was the woman who was actually responsible for sending Chandra off into space. So that's kind of how I dove into the Chandra mission, like having these two women as sort of, well, they were mentors to me. I don't know if they knew that, but they were for sure someone that I looked up to. So now for me, like, 22 years later, we have all of this incredible data that we get to work with because the astronaut and everybody, all of the engineers and everybody on the ground that worked so hard to get this mission up into space, to get it to function beautifully, and to be able to take data of the X-ray universe, which is a really special and surprising thing, I think. We're used to optical light, right? The type of light we can see with our eyes, but our universe has so much more to be able to discover when you can incorporate other types of information as well. And so when we are looking at a target, so for example, an exploded star, perhaps that might be nearby, say 10,000 light years away, which is just a hop, skip, and a jump, universally speaking, considering the size of the universe, we can point Chandra at that object for a pretty good amount of time. And that information is collected by the telescope, sent down through the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where you both are situated near, and then eventually makes its way to our laptops, here up in Cambridge, Mass. So when we're working through that data, scientists can essentially use the fingerprint of that information to be able to understand what of the data is moving away from us and what of it is moving towards us. And that helps you construct a 3D model. Once you have a 3D model, you can do any number of things with it. As we found, we started 3D printing because some friends and colleagues at the Smithsonian had recently 3D scanned and 3D printed President Obama's head. And I remember thinking at the time, like, well, if they could do that, surely I can figure out how to 3D print an exploded star, right? So that was sort of the inspiration. Our 3D model, oh, actually I have one right here. Our 3D model of this exploded star that I've been talking about, Chesapeake. Can you see that? There we go. So
yeah, looks good.
Oh, wow.
It's kind of spherical, right? It's kind of fun. In actuality, this is massive. It's about 40 million billion times the surface area of our sun and planet. So it's really big. And if you're like a Pluto fan, you can toss it in, no worries. The math won't matter. But it's really incredible because this is, a very gaseous, nebulous thing, of course, in outer space, and way too big for anyone to ever really hold. But when you can 3D print it, you can take a version and you can hold it in your hand, albeit scaled down. And this has actually been really important for us to work with communities, for example, communities where learners are blind or visually impaired. If they're not able to access the data, the visual data, in the same way that I'm able to, I want to make sure that there is a way that they can access this that is, in some cases, I think even better. So being able to hold a version of Cassie in your hand is pretty cool. So that's what I get to do all day.
That's amazing. And I'm so glad that you have the prop right there.
I know,
the
it's just, I forgot that I had it.
I imagine you're surrounded by cool things.
I actually am.
I mean, I guess also just wanted to sort of bring up the idea of who you were inspired by. I mean, Kim, you did mention a couple of mentors, but kind of diving into the idea of what this is all about in this conversation too, about kind of female figures in the past, or be them, you know, science people, be them women in your life. I'd like to kind of dive into sort of backstory and who inspired you to do what you're doing. And I know, Kim, you grazed on that a bit, but I think you could think of other people, and maybe even growing up, kind of figures that if you had someone to look up to and who they were. And I'd want Christina to sort of answer the same thing. Let's have Christina go first, because, you know, Kim, you just
good to break it up.
You to think about it a little bit.
Yeah, so it's a question I've actually been reflecting on, because I used to think that there was always going to be that one person, right? That, you know, they were everything that I was, and, you know, that was going to be my role model, my mentor, my inspiration. And what I've actually found, and maybe everybody finds this, I'm just, you know, a little slower at getting there, is that there's a piece of me in so many different people that I've run into, that I've worked with, even, you know, people every day that I see a different way of doing things, and that inspires me to try something different, and it pushes me and it amplifies me. But starting off like from the beginning, right? You know, it was actually, so it's funny, and it sounds cliche, but I think it also just shows the importance of, you know, a parent figure in your life, or an adult who really just breaks you out of your shell. And my mom was the person who actually introduced me to the library. And so, you know, my dad was actually studying to be an engineer. You know, he wanted to teach me calculus when I was 6, and I was like, no, it's not going to happen. But my mom introduced me to this beautiful place that we all have access to, which was the library. And the library was my inspiration to become a lifetime learner, and to share that, and to communicate that, and to make it accessible for everyone. And so, you know, all the people that I've discovered, right, you know, the Ellen Ochoa in my life, right, you know, it all came from a book at the library. And so, you know, going back to what makes a good mentor, what inspires you, for me, it was somebody who was able to give me a skill set that then branched me out into, you know, different types of roles and things. But I think it also, going back to Ellen Ochoa, right, you know, the first Latina in space, representation matters. And that's actually one of the things I loved about the app, right? Is that it showcases so many different women from different walks of life, different experiences, like using art in terms of science, right? And just this whole mix of things that it really might help somebody identify with somebody on the app, and maybe even kickstart their career into science and STEM. And so that was, you know, the other aspect of it.
Yeah, I think making it accessible is really important. And you and I are both sort of interested in art and science at the same time. I guess, all 3 of us, you could say, are, but, you know, not making those things necessarily be separately in life. So say, like, you know, I want my creative art painting background to like bleed into my idea for something at work. And suddenly that grows, and it helps that idea become more fluid for other people as well, and not just saying, you know, I don't know if you experience this, but I'm sure you both do, saying that you work with NASA. A lot of times people immediately see that as like, oh my gosh, no, how could I ever do that?
Yes.
And a mission that I think all 3 of us have, and not speaking for you, but I personally think that's how we have a lot of things in common, is to make those things accessible, to say, hey, yes, you have to work hard, but this is not impossible. And there are very different ways and paths to get there. And I think that's an important thing to note. Yeah. So Kim, what do you think?
Yeah. So first, Sasha, completely. I mean, I think I love hearing you say that specifically about, you know, someone hears, oh, they work with NASA, or they work on a NASA project or whatever, and then they think it's some unreachable goal. And it's really not the case. I mean, I remember in college, I actually like failed genetics. And I thought, like, I will never do anything now with this, because I just failed genetics and I'm just not smart enough to get through this. And to be honest, that failure actually pushed me out of molecular biology and into computer science, because I had been struggling, and that failure was kind of like, oh, like I just cannot seem to get this topic. And then I like sort of dove into computer science and found something that was just a much more natural fit for me, right? But I think sometimes it does seem like when you're working with an organization like NASA and the Smithsonian, it just seems like, oh, it's such a high bar to reach for. But everybody in these organizations has such unique stories, you know. And Christina, back to your answer, I loved your answer because it's like you could have plucked some of those things right out of my brain. I feel so much the same way, that it's all about like all of these little interactions. You can have these sort of mini mentorships with someone, and they don't necessarily even know it, right? Or you can have these sort of long-term exposures to people that just shape you and sort of help you see things in new ways. And for me, my first sort of really key relationship in that way was definitely my mom as well. She was a waitress at the time, and she wanted to do something different with her life. And she decided to go to night school to be able to become an assistant nurse. And so like one of my truly formative experiences when I was young was, I must have been like 5 or 6. I'd be like underneath the dining room table at night, like after school, and she would have like a massive anatomy book out and like all these like gross but awesome illustrations in it that I just like loved. And she would just study for like, you know, hours. And a couple times she even took me with her to her community college program. And I just remember thinking like she was the coolest person, because she was working and she was being a mom and she was doing night school, and like she was going to do something that she really wanted to do. So that set me on that same path. And honestly, the library thing too was exactly the same for me. My parents used to drop me off at the library and I would just spend like hours there. I'm such a nerd. I'm sorry. But yeah, it was.
Hey,
it was,
cool nerd. You're
Yeah, cool.
nerds are
And
cool.
High five.
with you.
So those like really early experiences, I think, were really important to me, but I don't think I knew how important they were until I actually had my own kids. And then like when I was, let me see, when my daughter was in 5th grade, I was doing a little intro talk at her school on exploded stars. And I had the kids do a little origami exercise to kind of talk about unpacking and how a star unpacks. And after the demonstration, one of my daughter's classmates came up to me and she said, I didn't know mommies could be scientists. And this was only 2015, right? This is not back in like 1975. Like I just remember feeling like it was such a beautiful moment because I was so excited that she felt comfortable sharing that with me. And also it was so useful for me to hear it. Like I needed to hear that because I hadn't been exposed to that, right? And I think it just shifted my viewpoint even more. And this app is just one of those little things that I try to do on the side with you all, best like colleagues ever, to try and make little impacts here and there. And you know, you don't really know if you ever do, but you hope so.
I do think that, yes, I think doing the outreach work and sort of getting into these places where, for instance, I'm pretty involved with girls in tech when I can be, and, you know, trying to just also say that you can come from different backgrounds and still get into a very kind of, I think data visualization, you have to have a very kind of strange amount of skills and interests to really like get dorky about it. And I think that there's not a perfect balance, right? Like the cake will still come out as a cake, but maybe with a little bit of more, you know, tang and a little bit like, you know, I don't know, I'm trying to think of, cakes actually have to be pretty specific, but you know what I'm saying here is that the ingredients can be the same, but they can be different and like have the outcome be beautiful and awesome. So yeah, I think the smaller impacts are important, but just to kind of, as you said, put that idea into the heads of a younger generation that maybe are just, you know, forming and beginning to think about what they like, and just being like, I see you doing that, and that's amazing. Plants that seed, that's very exciting and kind of something that I wish that I would have seen earlier in life. And I didn't really, but my mom was a scientist, and my dad is an engineer. And so I saw it through them, but I was like, well, of course they're doing it because they're my mom and dad and that's what they do. But seeing it from a third person perspective of someone coming into a school and saying, you know, I do this crazy thing that you might find nuts, but also you find children specifically sometimes coming up with even like some of the questions kids ask, I'm sure you both have experienced this, are way more intense than an adult's question, because not only it's open-ended and it's almost like, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. And you're like, okay, I need to rethink my career here for a second. This kid just stumped me. But I love that.
I do too.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that kind of brings us into the idea of we are at this place, I think that is a pinnacle for our time for women in STEM. I think just because of the eyes that get to be on these new careers and on these voices that are growing stronger and stronger. And so I just wanted to sort of get both of your perspectives on what do you see the future of women in STEM looking like? And how do you see the through line through today until, you know, the future? Christina, do you want to answer first?
Yeah, and it's actually something that I think about every day now, you know, especially in the last few months. And I think also trying to, you know, I've been working on this project for 5 years, and now I'm also trying to figure out, well, like, you know, what's next? Like, what does the future look like? And, you know, one of the things that I feel I've noticed, and it's a change from, you know, when I was in high school and college and, you know, from what my mom and, you know, other folks tell me, is that I feel there's a huge push now, not just, you know, the women supporting women, but women amplifying women, right? And I think, you know, especially in STEM, right, there was this culture of, you know, well, there could only be one token woman, right? There could only be one in the room because you didn't see any else. So you assume, well, there must be only one spot. And it created this sense of, you know, lack of community amongst women. And one thing that I've seen completely shift is that, you know, it's just other women, even women that, you know, I've had few interactions with, they're amplifying me, right? And then in turn, you're like, no, come on, like, I'll pull you up, right? And once you create a culture where it's not fear of like going away or somebody, you know, taking your light, like it's none of that, right? It's like the more women we have in a space, right, the more amplification, the more voices are heard, and all walks of life, right? Moms, you know, moms to be, you know, just not moms, like just a mix. That to me is going to create a better future. And what I've seen realistically on my project, right, is in spaces where there is a balance, or if not even majority women, it tends to be a more collaborative environment. You get different ideas, different experiences, and it's just fun, right? It's just like, I feel for the first time, like I have my guard down. I'm just, you know, talking to a bunch of my friends and colleagues, and it's a fun environment. And so amplification, and then also creating a culture of, you know, collaboration and camaraderie, and like we're all in it together. That's really where I see the future of women in STEM. And more importantly, this is what women can do to change the direction of where STEM goes. And I think that's what's really important.
I think that's a wonderful point, the point of lifting each other up. And I definitely feel that as well. Those connections are so strong once they're made, and you kind of like, or I see you, and
yeah,
you start this, like, it feels like a cool society that you're like, I have this, like, a bunch of friends that are gonna have my back, and, you know, when I get emotional or feel bad or have imposter syndrome, they will be there to be like, no, remember this and that. And so I do think that's a really good point of that. It's like a natural uplifting when that happens, because support is very important. Kim, what do you think?
Yeah, I sort of look at it as these two parallel issues, both recruitment and also retention, right? So clearly we need to make sure that we keep recruiting the best folks to be able to work on these things. We want to have all these different and diverse viewpoints, right? You want to have a diverse team, because that's when you get the best ideas and the best collaborations. Like, I've seen it over and over and over again throughout my career. And I mean, you can look at, for example, the new space toilet that they just launched to the International Space Station, right? The original space toilet was built by men and mostly for men, but the new space toilet takes female anatomy more into consideration and actually had women consulting on the project. And it makes a difference when you have to go to the bathroom in space, right? There's all of these issues that when you have more people at the table to give inputs, to help make those decisions, to formulate the ideas, to brainstorm, you end up with a better product. You end up with a stronger data set. You end up with, you know, the better idea of something new to try. And for me, I think I've seen it more often in spaces that tend to be a little younger. And I don't have any true data on this to back it up yet, but hopefully someone will do a study on it at some point. But, you know, if you look at high energy astrophysics, it's a younger field. It really kind of only started coming into being in the 60s and 70s, but like really ramped up with Chandra. So that's like a couple decades. Or even like exoplanets, for example, the idea of, you know, finding and understanding these planets outside of our solar system, that's only been going on since like the mid 90s, really, like the true data collection and actual discoveries. And when you look at those fields, they tend to have higher representations of women and more diverse people in general. So like, is it that they're younger fields and they have less structure, less hierarchical systems, or is it just seen as a new and exciting field entrant? I don't know. But if you look at those areas, like I definitely see them as like potential little case studies to be able to see, like, are there policies that you can learn and implement in your own organization based on how they hired, how they found candidates, based on how, you know, do they have better parent leave, I don't know, types of policies? Do they have better equitable pay policies? Like what's some of the glue that's making that work, if there is any, and if there's not, what are the improvements that we can make those? So yeah, I sort of see those sorts of issues as two sides of the same coin. You know, we have to get new voices in for the recruitment side, but then we also have to be able to retain people by having the policies to back it up, so that you're not just always fighting against an older system that doesn't fit for you necessarily. That was a long-winded answer. Hopefully that works.
No, that's a great answer. I think that they are both sides of the same coin, but they're very different, because when getting hired, you also are in a different mindset than being somewhere after 5 years and then kind of reevaluating, seeing like, why am I here? What am I doing here? Is this the environment I want to be in? Have I thrived? Have I been able to be, you know, supported in the way that I'd like to be? And I think for women, that becomes hard in a STEM place sometimes, in a place of work that is extremely, you know, there is still a competition in a sort of academia like feedback loop. And so I also think that can change as well, that it doesn't need to be in that sense of, you know, it doesn't need to be as academic. It can actually have this other life outside of it. And I think it's time for a lot of places to rethink those things that you mentioned. And we have a few minutes left here, and I think I wanted to end on a kind of a fun question. If you, I know we have a very diverse audience here. We have women, and I think this conversation has been extremely inspiring. So thank you both for all of your insights. However, if you were able to give advice to your younger self when you were first coming up into this career, what would you have told yourself to both, you know, make yourself feel not scared or intimidated, but also advice that has kind of helped to keep you grounded and keep you going, you know, forward through the perils of, and the wonderful and the horrible and everything that a career and a job and a passion gives? So Christina, do you want to give it?
Yeah,
easy question.
Good luck with that. I get time to think.
Yeah, exactly. I'll try and take my time, Kim. So I would say, well, one of the problems I had, and it actually wasn't until maybe a few years ago that I slowly started to let it go, is I was almost crippled by, you know, fear of failure, right? And we talk about this a lot in, you know, outreach, and especially, you know, in trying to support women going through STEM. But it was really like, it was the fear of, if I failed, that was going to be the straw that finally convinced me that I wasn't supposed to be in STEM, right? And so I remember being in college, right? And we would have a bunch of labs, right? Like a propulsion lab or space environments lab. And it was like, well, who wants to turn the valve to like start the rocket? You know, now I would be like, me. And if I break it, like, what's going to happen, right? It's this eagerness to just see how things work. But when I was, you know, in college, I would be like trying to almost hide myself so the teacher wouldn't pick on me, or professor rather. And so, you know, the advice I would give is that I know it's scary. I know, it's never fun to fail, right? I feel sometimes I, end up crying after a really rough day where I felt like it just, I didn't do my job. But that's what makes you better. And that's what helps you become an explorer, right? So I've learned to shift my mentality. When I fail, right, I'm an explorer, right? I'm in a new space. No one has done this before in my family. I'm pathfinding, like I'm just being an explorer. And if I fail, I'm going to learn from it and do it better next time. And so I've tried to kind of shift that because, back then, right, when we were exploring Antarctica, right, I'm sure those guys failed a lot, right? But now they've spun it, right? They're explorers. They were doing something cutting edge for the first time. So that's the philosophy shift that I try to instill. Like when folks ask, what would you tell yourself? You're an explorer, right? That's what you are. In terms of like how I pick myself up, it's hard, right? So I actually have a morning mantra that I tell myself, every morning. It's actually posted on my bathroom, and it's a poem, right? And it just talks about, like, what is it that's going to light the fire inside of you, right? And every morning, no matter how the day ended, if you start off with that, mini morning meditation, morning mantra, it just gives you perspective of what your values are, what you see is positive in you, and you just kind of kickstart the day. And after I do that, I call a rover wake up song, right? So when we wake up the rover on Mars, right, we kick off the shift with like a fun song, right, to just get everybody going, right? And on any given day, I play my rover wake up song, right, on full blast while I'm dancing around, getting ready to just kind of make the day positive, right? And that's really what we need to bring more into it. So that's kind of my 2 cents on that.
We are explorers. I love that so much.
I love that. And I think we're almost at time, but I'll just say that, like Christina said, and she put it beautifully, it's okay to fail. It's okay to ask for help. That's something that I struggled with a lot when I was younger. I just felt like I should be smart enough to not have to ask for help. I don't know why. I thought that's kind of ridiculous, but that's what I thought. And I encourage everybody to not do that. But also probably the most important thing is to get outside of your bubble. Make yourself uncomfortable. It's okay. For me, for example, like my kids, both my son and my daughter, just, they think all moms are scientists. Like that's fine for them. But it wasn't until I was in my daughter's class and heard from one of her classmates that she had no idea moms could be scientists, that I realized, oh, right. Like I need to look around more, look around and see what other folks are doing and how other people are exploring the world. And that's been really, really important to me. So yeah, I'll just end there. I think we're almost out of time. So.
We are. And so actually I just want to thank both of you for participating in this today. I think these insights have been so nice. And, just the fact that we are here because we worked together on an app but this goes so much further. And so I just want to end by saying thank you both, and thank you, Kim, for organizing this for us. And I think that this has been great.
Yeah, we can all reach across the stars. Let's do it.
Yes.
Thanks, Sasha.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies. That was great to hear about the impactful work you're doing in making women's work in STEM accessible and inspiring. Next, we'll hear from Alexis Ryder, doctoral candidate in History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Her presentation, Bodies in the Field, Ursula Marvin and the Antarctic Search for Meteorites, focuses on the highly successful geologist and historian, Ursula Marvin. Alexis, over to you.
On the screen in front of you are 2 documents I found in geologist Ursula Marvin's archives, which are held at the Smithsonian, where she worked as a planetary scientist from 1960 until her retirement in the early 2000s. On the left is a newspaper article published in the Sunday Herald in 1969 that describes Marvin's laboratory work in the most overtly sexist of terms. Titled, "A Little Pinch to Make Lady Rapturously Happy Geologist," the article opens, quote, "Ursula B. Marvin nearly dissolved Tuesday morning, and it wasn't from the heat. She was excited over the promise of a little pinch," end quote. The salacious punchline to this sentence is that the pinch, quote, won't be the kind girls sometimes get on the MTA, end quote, but rather is a sample of lunar dust that Marvin will be studying with rigor and skill. On the right is a poster for a talk Marvin gave over a decade later, after she had spent time hunting for meteorites in Antarctica as part of ANSMET, the Antarctic Search for Meteorites, a joint program run annually by NSF, NASA, and the Smithsonian. In this poster, Marvin is described as an explorer and a rock hound who has spent time in some of the world's, quote, strangest and most dangerous sites, including Observatory Hill. Observatory Hill is the location of the Smithsonian's Astrophysical Observatory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The wonderful speakers after me will focus on gender inequalities in polar research, something that Marvin's experiences as part of the field team in Antarctica in 1979 and 1982 certainly reveal. But what I want to quickly highlight today is how gendered assumptions, by which I mean the ways gender was expressed and expected to be seen, changed dramatically in different scientific locales. Both laboratories and field sites were bound up with ideals of masculinity, the first being a site of this kind of male genius, and the second a site of male grit. So how gender bias manifested in a lab versus in the field was really different. And so women adapted different mechanisms for coping with and overcoming or finding workarounds for these gendered stereotypes. Marvin was trained as a geologist, very much a field-based discipline, but she became a planetary scientist, necessarily a lab-based discipline. Through her, we can therefore see how delicately a woman had to navigate the inherently masculine spaces of science. Marvin worked in the field around the globe, but Antarctica is really the most vivid example of the masculine world of field research. As she put it, quote, geology was always a macho science, based on camaraderie, being outside in all weather, beyond roads and trails in wild places, end quote. As she saw it, the whole mystique was threatened by the admission of women. This trope was even more potent in Antarctica, with its history of heroic and often doomed expeditions and dangerous conditions. As Marvin said, quote, you talk about macho, Antarctic science is more so by orders of magnitude, end quote. In the field then, Marvin was conscious that her body and her actions might be deemed too feminine, and she recalls how hard she worked to be seen as part of the team, putting in hard physical labor, keeping quiet when she was either tired or cold, and sometimes soothing male egos by feigning to not understand things so that they could be explained to her. As hard as she tried, though, gender bias in the field manifested. In the 1982 field season, she was left behind at camp one day with no discussion. After tidying up and getting things in order, Marvin penned a furious diary entry reflecting, quote, I wondered all day long what their friendship is worth to me and whether and how to tell them what I think. I can be treated as an unperson once, but I cannot be treated as an unperson twice. The word unperson here is so revealing. To be excluded from the masculine space of fieldwork was to be rendered nothing, no one at all. The lab was also historically constructed as a space of masculine exceptionalism, a place where purported genius, a trope that is very much bound up with gender ideas, would flourish. Marvin was proud to be the first female teaching assistant in the geology lab at Harvard as a student. But later in life, she wrote that, quote, I never knew that I was paid less as a research assistant and teaching assistant than our male colleagues were. I never knew a lot of things. Even as an exceptional scientist, she was treated as a kind of unperson and seen as different than her male lab colleagues. Marvin's work at SAO was cutting edge. She analyzed meteorites and lunar samples brought back from the Apollo missions. But her work, while seen as useful, was often dismissed as menial and boring. In performance appraisals by her all-male colleagues, her work was described as, quote, competent, useful, necessary, and largely unexciting, with a weakness for a, quote, lack of originality, end quote. Meanwhile, male colleagues working on the exact same tasks and work were seen and described as geniuses. Gender tropes surrounding intellect thus permeated the lab and meant that even while doing the same work as her colleagues, Marvin's contributions were deemed of less intellectual value, an evaluation that had direct material ramifications. She was paid less. Both the lab and the field were ostensibly open to women in the 1960s, but Marvin's career shows us just how open or unopen these spaces really were. To be a woman in the field sciences meant to either lean into the tropes of masculine physicality or to be deemed an unperson. To be a woman in the lab sciences meant to be seen as a workhorse, excited by a little pinch, but unable to possess the genius of a true scientist. What we learn from Ursula Marvin's amazing career then is this: gender inequality cannot simply be fixed by the opening of spaces to women. The gender system is far more pervasive than that. It contours behaviors, expectations, and constrains and manages opportunities. We are embedded in it daily, and it was, and often still is, women who must adapt and conform, or work in order to be seen as somehow includable. So to return to the two images on the screen in front of you. Together, these archival finds provide an excellent frame through which to reflect on the experience of women in the sciences in the mid to late 20th century, and to see how normative gender assumptions shaped perceptions of their work. In the first image, where Marvin is ensconced in the laboratory, her gender is placed front and center, used to cast her as an anomaly and to undermine the seriousness of her research matter. In the second image, Marvin is described in terms that have traditionally been understood as masculine, positioning her as an anomaly who, despite her gender, has been an adventurer and explorer and out in the field. Whether working in the lab or the field, Marvin's gender is the category through which her work is understood. She is positioned as a woman first and a scientist second. In telling Marvin's history, which I do in far more detail in my broader project, I hope to complicate this construction by revealing it as a lens through which to see, but not to define, Marvin's life and work. Her very capacity to see the gendered nature of scientific research and the deftness with which she navigated both the lab and the field make her an exemplary case study of what it meant to be a woman in science in the post-war period. Okay. I'll now hand over the panel on gender inequalities and polar research, which will expand on some of the themes that I've touched on here. But first, I just want to say thank you to the American Women's History Initiative for having me, to all of the amazing people at the Smithsonian Institution Archives who helped me with my research while I was there, and especially to Pam Henson, the historian at SIA and my advisor while I was there, whose wealth of knowledge, generosity of time, and just amazing and thrilling stories that she could tell me really made my time while I was in DC. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. What an incredible career Dr. Marvin had. We will now have a 5-minute break before we begin our next panel. Take this time to stretch, grab a drink or a snack, and during that time, we'll play a short video. See you back soon. Welcome back. Our next panel, Breaking the Ice Ceiling, Trailblazing Women in Arctic and Antarctic Science, features Dr. Victoria Herman, Managing Director at the Arctic Institute, Sarah Pickman, Doctoral Candidate of History of Science and Medicine at Yale University, Dr. Daniela McCahey, Assistant Professor at Texas Tech University, Morgan C., Geographer and Doctoral Candidate at the University of Cambridge, Dr. Renuka Bhatti, Executive Secretary of the European Polar Board, and Susan Eaton, founder and leader of the Sedna Epic Expedition. Dr. Herman, over to you.
Welcome to Breaking the Ice Ceiling, Trailblazing Women in Arctic and Antarctic Science, a session highlighting the challenges, courage, and achievements of women at the poles. My name's Victoria Herman, and I'm the managing director of the Arctic Institute, a nonprofit organization working to help inform policy for a secure, just, and sustainable Arctic through multidisciplinary research. My own research focuses on climate change adaptation, how policies, practitioners, and researchers can best support communities adapting to the climate impacts we can no longer avoid. When I sat down to write the introductory words to our session today, I thought about a 2-year research trip I took in 2016 and 2017. My research partner and I traveled across the United States and US territories to interview more than 350 local leaders on the front lines of climate adaptation. Funded by National Geographic and partnered with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, our goal was to identify gaps in assistance at the national level for communities facing more extreme weather, flooding, and sea level rise. During that trip, I expected to find strong local leaders acting on climate. But I'll admit, I didn't expect to find that the face of local climate champions was overwhelmingly female. Through my work, I met women leaders in every corner of this country who have dedicated their lives, their careers to safeguarding their cultures, traditions, and communities from a rapidly warming world. I think I was so surprised because there's a discrepancy in how we tell America's climate change story. For most of my career, policy negotiations, expert interviews on the news, and even marches in environmental activism were visually led by men. When women show up in climate stories, they're often victims. Women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate impacts, whether it's mothers working hard to find clean water or grandmothers opening their homes to shelter extended family in the aftermath of storms. But socioeconomic vulnerabilities do not equate to victimhood. Women are strong, resilient knowledge holders, and they, I learned, were leading the transition to a sustainable, resilient future. They were already doing the work, but we needed to change the visible story of climate change and write women leaders into that narrative. Our session today contributes to a growing movement to write women into polar science's past, present, and future story. You'll hear from 5 inspiring women today that will present on the history of trailblazing women in polar research and the intersection of gender and imperialism in polar science. You'll hear about current women scientists pioneering collaborations between American and international polar research communities. And you'll hear about the future of inclusion in Arctic sciences and how individuals are inspiring the next generation of girls in science. To kick us off today, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Pickman to start off our panel. Sarah?
Thank you, Victoria. Today, I'm speaking to you on behalf of myself and my colleague, Dr. Nana Colland. While university-trained women scientists from Europe, the United States, and other parts of the world have been participating in Arctic science in increasing numbers over the past half-century, indigenous women have been an important part of scientific research in the Arctic for hundreds of years. The traditional image of the Arctic explorer is familiar to most, a white man overcoming danger to conquer nature with his own hands and ingenuity. This normative Western idea of masculinity was central to the construction of explorers' identities in the 19th century and beyond. However, Arctic expeditions typically relied heavily on the knowledge, skills, and labor of indigenous Arctic women. Arctic women were a source of environmental and cultural knowledge for Western expeditions, acted as translators and guides, and sewed the complex fur clothes that explorers needed to survive in freezing temperatures. But the contributions of these women were usually completely erased, or at least obscured, by returning explorers, who were reluctant to acknowledge their debt to non-Western peoples. As a result, these indigenous interlocutors have gone unrecognized, at least until recently. While the myth of the heroic white male expedition leader doing everything by himself has endured. Today, we will introduce you to 2 Inuit women who worked with American explorers, whose stories we, together with other historians, are now trying to recover. Tukulito, or Takalutuk, also known as Hannah during her lifetime, was born around 1838 in the Cumberland Sound area of Baffin Island. In 1860, Tukulito and her husband, Ibierbing, also known as Joe during this period, met the American editor turned explorer Charles Francis Hall. Hall was looking for traces of the lost British expedition commanded by John Franklin, but had no experience traveling in the Arctic. On the recommendation of whalers working in the Cumberland Sound area, Hall sought out Tukulito and Ibierbing to help him with his travels. Over the following decade, Tukulito, Ibierbing, and Hall traveled together throughout the Arctic and the US, and Tukulito and Ibierbing were indispensable to Hall as guides, as translators, and as knowledge makers. In particular, Tukulito's knowledge and skills formed a central part of the scientific results which Hall claimed as his own. Compared to other Inuit women in similar situations, we know a lot about Tukulito, both from her own hand and in descriptions from contemporary American newspapers. Though Tukulito could read and write in English, her personal letters were shaped by the fact that she and her family were dependent on Hall while in the United States. Additionally, much of the American and European writing about the Inuit in the 19th century was colored by the violence of colonialism and white Christian patriarchy. This was true even in Hall's writings, as he sought to portray his relationship with Tukulito and Ibierbing in certain ways. Yet it is still possible to understand how valuable Tukulito's expertise was to Hall by comparing the explorer's private journals to his published writings, a process that scholar Esther Lesra refers to as looking for a transfigurative gap, I should say, or opening in the archive. Such analysis shows that erasing the expertise of Inuit, particularly Inuit women, was a key part of the explorer's toolkit at the time. Now, we would like to introduce you to another historic indigenous Arctic woman, Panagobluk. Panagobluk was the primary informant for and companion of Vilhjalmur Stefansson, a Canadian-American Arctic explorer and anthropologist of Icelandic descent, who was active in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. On his second expedition in 1908, Stefansson hired Panagobluk, a widow from northern Alaska, to make clothing for him and a fellow white anthropologist. On this expedition, and his third and final one from 1913 to 1918, Panagobluk was Stefansson's translator, his primary source of anthropological information, and his interlocutor who made introductions for him to various Inuit communities. After returning from the Arctic in 1918, Stefansson made a career publishing books and articles about the knowledge he'd gleaned from the Inuit, promoting himself as a consummate Arctic expert. But Stefansson never fully acknowledged that his work or his position as an authority on Arctic matters would not have been possible without Panagobluk. Stefansson's biographer, Gisli Paulsen, has written, like most of his contemporaries, Stefansson was unable to acknowledge the intellectual role of his indigenous collaborators, in particular, women. The fact that Stefansson and Panagobluk had a child together, Alex Stefansson, born in 1910, further complicates their relationship. After Stefansson left the Arctic for the last time in 1918, he never saw his son again. As the geographers Felix Driver and Laurie Jones have argued, exploration knowledge was always the product of labor co-produced by Westerners and non-Westerners, even if Western explorers sought to hide this fact. However, careful reading of historic archival and published documents, photographs, and even oral histories can help reveal the presence of Indigenous members of expeditions and the expertise they contributed. Therefore, we should be trying to make sure that women like Tukulito, Panagobluk, and countless other Indigenous Arctic women are part of any conversation about women in Arctic science. Now I'm going to turn things over to Daniela McKay to talk about another remarkable woman in the history of Arctic science.
Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah suggested, until fairly recently, narratives of polar exploration almost exclusively focused on the adventures of European and American explorers. Though these biographies are still popular, a growing number of historians, like Sarah and Nana, are situating the stories of these explorers within context of colonial and indigenous studies. But with the jump from heroic great man histories to the subaltern studies of today, there's essentially been a skipping over of the European and American women who seem to fit the mold of being great men, or rather, great women. Today, I'll talk about the life of one such explorer and explain how her biography can help us better understand Arctic science in this period, such as the ways that Arctic exploration was gendered, how polar science was often conducted by self-trained amateurs, and the ways that the Arctic fit within American imperialism. Louise Arner Boyd was born in California in 1887. Predeceased by her brothers and parents, in 1920, Boyd inherited a large fortune. Boyd enjoyed travel, and in 1926, she chartered a ship for her own expedition to the Arctic. She received international attention for her exploits, including polar bear hunts. In 1928, after Roald Amundsen's disappearance, she joined the search party and traveled about 10,000 miles through Arctic seas and was honored by the Norwegian government, though Amundsen was never found. On subsequent expeditions, she photographed, surveyed, and recorded hundreds of botanical specimens on the northern and eastern coasts of Greenland, observations which were published in 1935. Before 1940, she had organized 6 expeditions to the Arctic. Besides acting as the botanist and photographer, she pioneered the use of a heavy aerial mapping camera to document glacial landscapes at ground level. She also wrote ethnographic accounts of her encounters with indigenous people. After the outbreak of the Second World War, the US government requested that she lead a geophysical expedition, primarily to obtain data on the transmission of radio waves in the Arctic regions. She chartered and outfitted a ship at her own expense. The scientific team studied the ionosphere, geomagnetism, and the aurora. Once they returned in 1941, she continued working for the US Army. She published another book on Northeast Greenland in 1948. In 1955, she became the first woman to fly over the North Pole. When Boyd died in 1972, she had essentially spent her entire fortune on Arctic exploration. So what does Boyd tell us about Arctic science? First, the fixation of the press on her gender shows us how much Arctic science was classified as a masculine activity. Lincoln Ellsworth, a contemporary, was also born into wealth, which he used to fund polar expeditions, but her press coverage is full of words like society, heiress, and debutante, while his usually just says explorer. The focus of the press's attention was the apparent incongruity of a wealthy socialite, contrasting against the idea that Arctic exploration was an activity not only for men, but for the most masculine of men. Not only was her status as an Arctic explorer an object of fascination because of her background, it was only possible because of her background. As a woman who was both unmarried and extremely wealthy, she could be independent. As a scientist, Boyd was largely self-educated. However, this is another example of how in this period, polar science was still in its infancy and generally more flexible about who could participate. Additionally, her social status gave her access to organizations such as the American Geographical Society, the California Academy of Sciences, and the American Polar Society, affiliations that bolstered her credibility. Finally, the interest of the US Army in her work during the Second World War shows that the American interest in geopolitical and strategic possibilities in the Arctic and how it saw science as a means to gain the upper hand. This ended up playing up extensively during the Cold War, when the Arctic took on immense strategic value. Unlike some of the indigenous women that Sarah mentioned, Boyd's life is extremely well documented. But her name is not well known when compared to her male contemporaries. Louise Boyd simultaneously breaks the mold of our traditional idea of a polar explorer while also epitomizing many aspects of polar science in the first half of the 20th century. But it's actually because of this unusual positioning that we can use her life and her career to better understand the nature of Arctic science and exploration in this period. Now I'm going to hand it over to Morgan Sieg, who will move us south to the Antarctic and discuss how women were systematically excluded from polar research in the second half of the 20th century.
Thanks, Daniela. I'm going to take you all through a quick tour of Antarctic history, following a path through the historical roots of today's gender inequalities in Antarctic research. It's useful to start with some context. Men have been conducting science in Antarctica for over 100 years, since the so-called heroic age of Antarctic exploration. But women across the world were categorically barred from conducting research in Antarctica through most of the 20th century. Not a single woman scientist was permitted to work in the Antarctic region at all until 1956, when the Soviets included women on an Antarctic research vessel. The first Argentinian women to work on the continent did so in 1968. The US barred women from its Antarctic stations until 1969. Australia barred women from Antarctica until 1974. And the UK barred women until 1985. The US kept some of its field opportunities closed to women until 1979, and the UK kept some Antarctic opportunities closed to women until 1996. And to be clear, the absence of women from Antarctica had nothing to do with women's interest or capability. Women had been trying to work in Antarctica since the early 20th century, applying to join the expeditions of Ernest Shackleton and Richard Byrd, among others. But those expeditions, like expeditions from the West to the Arctic, were designed to portray images of nationalistic, heroic masculinity, and there was no place for women. Later, when the US Antarctic Research Program was founded in the late 1950s, women began applying to conduct fieldwork on the continent from the start. But still, they were forbidden year after year. So why were they barred? On the surface, women were denied access to Antarctica on the grounds that there were simply no facilities for women on the continent. There were no women's quarters and no women's toilets. The no facilities excuse was superficial but ubiquitous, also used to keep women out of many other remote environments at the time, including research vessels, Arctic field stations, and NASA's astronaut corps. But the no facilities excuse was rooted in deeper concerns about sexuality and risk in remote environments. Essentially, Antarctic leaders were worried about men's behavior, men who might be distracted by women, who might become jealous of one another and destabilize isolated station communities. Admiral George Dufek, who led the US Navy's science support efforts in Antarctica in the 1950s, once claimed that, quote, "Women will not be allowed in the Antarctic until we can provide one woman for every man." And those concerns about sexuality, in turn, were underpinned by deeper ideological anxieties. It was feared that women's presence would be emasculating, that men would become disenchanted with Antarctic fieldwork once the heroic mythology of its origin stories had been dispelled. The fact was, work and life in Antarctica was often mundane and relatively safe. In 1959, Admiral Dufek was quoted saying that women's presence would, quote, "wreck the illusion of being frontiersmen going into a new land and the illusion of being a hero." Here again, we see that exclusionary narrative of white male heroism that Sarah and Daniela mentioned earlier. So how did things change? There were, of course, many factors at play. Pressures from the federal government to move toward equal opportunities in an era of sweeping social change, an increasing number of women earning science degrees, and, significantly, the continuous pressure applied by women and male allies. And alongside all this were less obvious but still important cultural influences. In the mid-20th century, Antarctica was coming to be seen less as a space for heroic exploration and more as a space for modern science. This shift was linked to geopolitics, as the 1959 Antarctic Treaty set the continent aside for peaceful scientific purposes. It also was linked to institutional changes, as the US Navy began withdrawing from Antarctica, leaving the National Science Foundation with greater influence over US Antarctic stations and Antarctic cultures. Essentially, Admiral Dufek's heroic illusion was being replaced by narratives of Antarctica as a natural laboratory, a change that opened space for reimagining who exactly belonged on the continent. And of course, scientific narratives could not have been gender neutral, given the ongoing marginalization of women, and especially women of color, from science. And even scientific narratives often embrace heroic tropes. But still, those scientific narratives proved to be more inclusive of women and people of color than the traditional heroic narratives. Of course, We still have a long way to go toward gender equality in the field. Black and Indigenous women remain especially underrepresented in Antarctic science and in our mainstream historical narratives. Happily, this symposium is giving us many new and more inclusive stories to tell. And with that, I'll hand it over to Renuka Bade, who will bring the story of women in polar research into the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan, for providing such a fantastic context to what we work on in the Women in Polar Science Network. When we say women in polar science, we really mean all the women in the polar research world. Those that do the research in any field, to those that administer and manage, those that support the research by logistics, the technicians, the engineers, those that teach, educate, and communicate in and on polar research, and all those who aspire to do so as well. This event comes at an important moment when we are recognizing and conversing about diversity, inclusion, and equity globally. Initiatives like Women in Polar Science and Women of the Arctic contribute to these ongoing global conversations by shining a light on the achievements and also the barriers faced by women in the polar regions. Through collaborative activities and connections with initiatives such as the Women of the Arctic, Pride in Polar Research, Minorities in Polar Research, an intersectional approach to diversity, inclusion, and equity in the Arctic and Antarctic is possible. As polar researchers ourselves, we found it quite difficult to find inspiring female role models who seem to be few and far between. As we realized that the problem being faced by us was common to many in the polar world, the four of us co-founders came together in 2014, and that's how the Women in Polar Science Network began. Our main aim was to build a strong, global, diverse network of women researchers of various ages across disciplines and geographies, and from all backgrounds, and all of the many intersecting identities. Women in Polar Science began as a conversation in New Zealand with a far larger than expected crowd in attendance, therein highlighting the need and the urgency for such a network. We have now built up the network to what it is today, over 10,000 strong, over several different platforms. What are the benefits of a network like this? We increase representation by showcasing and celebrating stories of inspiring women who work on polar research across disciplines, experiences, and geographies. We've run several campaigns so far, including on social media like Twitter, Instagram, and by hosting many in-person events as well. Many of our WIPs, as we call them, allies, with allies, co-organized and participated in a Wikibomb event in 2016 to increase the number of women polar research biographies on Wikipedia. To date, polar research remains one of the few fields where women outnumber men on Wikipedia. We hold events where we talk about systemic issues related to diversity and equity, and discuss possible solutions for polar research. This gives an impetus for change in the different polar organizations globally. So, we are inspiring a new generation, leading by example, promoting diversity and inclusiveness for institutes, organizations, and also providing opportunities for women in polar science to strengthen connections within their networks, for mentoring opportunities, and support for very specific polar working conditions. WIPS hopes to continue for many years to come with a shared aspiration for a bright and inclusive future for polar research, supporting a diverse global community of researchers and helping them thrive and achieve the best of their potential. Beyond the polar sciences, the roles and contributions of women to northern policy making, to daily life and community, and to art often also remain far from the limelight. Similar to our story with WIPS, Gosia Smechik and Tani Pryor, two researchers in the Arctic social sciences, noted a mushrooming of Arctic venues, including policy meetings and academic conferences over the past decade. Amidst all of these events, though, initiatives focusing on Arctic women, the successes that they achieve and the challenges that they face, were often few and far between. The equal representation of women on Arctic conference panels is still far from standard, with women's perspectives often missing from the debate. Despite women's critical role in their communities, their societal and political engagement, and their high levels of expertise and credentials. To remedy this, Goshia and Tahani brought together indigenous and non-indigenous women of various backgrounds, decision makers, activists, researchers, and artists from all Arctic states to the 2018 University of the Arctic Congress in Helsinki to discuss issues related to women's representation in northern policymaking, the role and contributions of women in polar research and knowledge production, and the very painful realities and means of addressing issues like gender-based violence, which disproportionately impacts the lives of northern women and children. The extraordinary conversations and connections forged at this event became the foundation of the Women of the Arctic, a non-profit based in Finland, which aims to raise awareness, support, and maintain a focus on women's and gender-related issues in the Arctic. In addition to its in-person events, Women of the Arctic launched a digital storytelling platform called Plan A to maintain a long-term focus on many of these issues. Amongst other things, the platform includes 100+ videos, interviews featuring the reflections of 11 credible women on the environment, business, exploration, politics, the arts, and much, much more. More recently, Women of the Arctic is leading the Gender and Environment chapter of the Gender Equality in the Arctic report of the Sustainable Development Working Group of the Arctic Council. The polar regions are at the forefront of significant global changes. We believe that it is high time that we begin to do things differently on many fronts. Gender equality should be a baseline across all societal, political, and economic dimensions. We cannot have a sustainable world or sustainable polar regions unless all genders and peoples are equal and receive equal treatment. Women in polar science and Women of the Arctic have been able to showcase the incredible work of women like Susan Eaton, who will take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Renuka, for your overview of women in polar science and also of Women of the Arctic. I had the pleasure of presenting in Helsinki in September 2018 at Women of the Arctic, and it was a powerful movement of women together, and it continues today, so I'm glad to have been part of that. Today, I'd like to introduce you to my subject, which is the Sedna Epic Expedition. It's an all-female team of explorers, scientists, artists, educators, academicians, and scuba divers and scientific divers. Sedna is the Inuit goddess of the sea. From Alaska to Greenland, she's the mother of all marine mammals. And it's only fitting that an all-female team that is exploring Arctic waters and doing science at the same time has Sedna on our side. And she snorkels with us and scuba dives with us daily. One day she's a narwhal. The next day she takes the shape of a polar bear or a beluga. So Sedna is the name of the expedition. And our mission is to empower the next generation of women Arctic leaders. Everyone knows this map. This is the Northwest Passage. And from Pond Inlet all the way to Tuktoyaktuk, Inuvik, on the west side of Canada, it's 3,000 kilometers long, or 2,000 miles roughly. And this was my fixation to snorkel the Northwest Passage, actually. And in the traditional sense of explorers, of the heroic era of exploration, I set my sights on conquering the Northwest Passage in the snorkel zone. A very male-dominated paradigm, of course. We've been talking about colonialism intersecting with exploration. And when I put this advertisement out to the world, it was picked up by all the international news media. Women want it for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete sunlight, because this would happen in the summer months, constant danger, safe return, hopeful. Ernest Shackleton said doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Now, my presentation today really is about the evolution from 2013 to today, 7 years later, having run 4 female expeditions, having gone to Greenland twice, Nunavut twice, Baffin Island, the Northwest Passage, Iceland, Norway, I think that's about it, more than 85 women. I fully reject this premise now, and I'm going to tell you what I've learned by leading a team of women explorers to the Arctic. And it involves the intersection of exploration and indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge. So this is how it all started for me, 2013, with a standing ovation at the Explorers Club, of course, to what I'm doing today, which in some cases men discount as not exploration because it's female-centric, and it involves engaging with Inuit women and girls in communities in the Arctic. So what is Sedna? Initially, as I said, a snorkel relay of the Northwest Passage. To borrow a phrase from Star Trek, we would boldly go where no man has gone before as a team of women. In the process, we would explore the snorkel zone and study disappearing sea ice in the Arctic. And the fact that we could snorkel the Northwest Passage in a relay was predicated on the fact that sea ice is disappearing and that it is possible to snorkel the Northwest Passage. But along the way, we had planned, even from the very beginning, to bring the ocean to eye level for largely non-swimming Inuit in communities along the Northwest Passage, using remotely operated vehicles, mobile aquariums, and leading snorkel safaris for Inuit, which we have done in Greenland and in Labrador, northern Canada, Labrador, and then also in Nunavut to the north, Baffin Island and the Northwest Passage. And our expedition is a call to action, a call to combine indigenous and scientific knowledge side by side, and in fact to inform our scientific data collection with Inuit knowledge at the very beginning with our advisors. And obviously the outcome would be to mitigate global warming and to equip Inuit in communities where climate change is happening at rapid rates with a toolkit to deal with climate change in their backyards. We want to empower women and girls and develop leaders in the Inuit communities. And in these matriarchal communities, the women are the leaders. And of course, climate change. A lot of people have asked me if Sedna does not like men. Is that why we're all women? And in fact, the reason we're all women is because the communities are matriarchal in their structure. And if we want to affect community change, we want to educate and inspire and empower, we're working in communities with women and girls. So that is why we are all women. Apart from the fact that it gives women a very great opportunity to get field experience in a very safe environment, which is not the case in the 3 expeditions that I've experienced in Antarctica myself. I've moved from Antarctica to the Arctic, by the way, in the past decade. So it's a safe space for women to explore the Arctic, to conduct research, and to learn about the issues that are facing the people of the Arctic, the indigenous people. Again, we want to be female role models, and not solely for women in science, but we're for women in the arts and women in exploration. And we've heard about some very early Inuit women explorers earlier today, and I'm very excited about these stories because most Inuit women in North America, probably from Alaska to Canada, don't know those stories. And I'd love to share those stories with the Inuit women in our team in the future. We are making space for Inuit women and girls to travel through the Arctic with us, to be part of our science teams, and to learn in terms of what we do. And in fact, we're learning far more from them than they are from us, I can tell you that. So 3 expeditions to the Arctic and 1 to northern Norway in November at 70 degrees north latitude. Ocean science was conducted. Snorkel relays were conducted. This was the proof of concept up the Labrador coast on that vessel, across the Davis Strait, snorkeling in 9,000 feet of water in the Davis Strait and up the west coast of Greenland. We proved that we can travel at 70 kilometers per day with diver propulsion vehicles. And if we did, in fact, want to snorkel the Northwest Passage, it is within our grasp. But the bigger question after leading 4 expeditions with 85 women is, why would we want to do that? It's a very old-fashioned paradigm, which all of us have been discussing today, and none of us really embrace. The world has changed, and there would be a lot of carbon produced for a group of women to snorkel the Northwest Passage in a dedicated vessel. This is a team of women in 2014. We're standing on the bow of the MV Cape Race. on the Arctic Circle offshore Western Greenland. We've just been the first group of people in the world to snorkel across the Arctic Circle. So we're all very proud of ourselves. It's about midnight here in July 2014. This expedition happened in 2018, and this was the route we were going to leave from Resolute in the Northwest Passage in Canada, travel to the south and east across the Davis Strait and go to Greenland. But in my experience, based on ice conditions from 2014 to present in the Arctic, at least in the Canadian Arctic, you never get to go where you think you're going to go. And this is actually the route that we took because of pack ice in the Northwest Passage near Devon Island. We crossed the Davis Strait twice on this expedition when we had planned to actually start inside the Northwest Passage and travel to Beechey Island to see some of the graves from the early Franklin expedition in the 1850s. We are working in communities with Inuit women and girls, and we're not forgetting the boys, by the way, because we're running ocean science programs to bring the ocean to eye level for largely non-swimming Inuit youth. There aren't many swimming pools and communities in the Arctic, and death by drowning is one of the leading causes of mortality of Inuit, either falling out of boats and drowning, or their snowmobiles are falling through the ice because they can no longer read the ice conditions due to climate change, thinning ice, and disappearing sea ice. This is one of our scientific divers collecting sea critters in northern Labrador, Nunatsiavut, and Nain, Labrador. We engaged the local children to help us bring the animals out of the water and into the aquariums where we have touch tanks, and we show the young people and their parents and their grandparents what lives beneath the waves, because these animals are invisible to Inuit, generally speaking, unless they wash ashore dead. And so the kids get involved in touching these animals. We evaluate their level of interest. We ask them questions. They don't know these animals. They haven't seen these animals. And very occasionally, one of the parents or the grandparents knows an Inuktitut name for these animals. And we may find out if there's legends associated with some of these animals. Very simple, but these animals live very deep in the Arctic due to sea ice scour, and what we would see in the intertidal zone in North America is sitting between 20 and 40 feet of water depth, which is interesting to us. Our success in the Arctic is based on the fact that we actually collaborate at the very beginning, long before we arrive in the Arctic, with Inuit partners, with Inuit cultural advisors, men and women, by the way, because there's no point in going to the Arctic as a research group if we're just going to study it from a Southern perspective. We really do want to know what the Inuit know. And we have been collaborating with Inuit since 2015 in the past 5 years. And I can tell you that our expeditions have been far richer because of our indigenous participation. Communities open their doors to us, and we're able to provide culturally relevant ocean knowledge sharing and mobilization programs for the Inuit. This is IU Peter on the right-hand side, my left-hand side, and Johnny Isilak on the right. And these Inuit leaders have facilitated us being very successful in Frobisher Bay and Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut. I'm going to show you some photographs from Iqaluit, which is Nunavut. This is our day on the ice, and you can see Johnny and IU in the front with the team who's been scuba diving and snorkeling in pack ice. And this is our robot program that we offer to all children, boys and girls. And this happens to be a group of young Inuit girls who are looking at all the PVC pipe to build these underwater robots, which are equipped with cameras so the kids can see what lives underwater, because they don't swim, as I said, in general. So this is one of our team members with these young women, lots of great conversations going on about building robots. And I can tell you the girls are probably even better at it than the boys. Very exciting. And we bring the robots to the communities and endow the communities with the robots so the teachers can use them for future teaching. Here is our robot day in Iqaluit in Frobisher Bay. IU standing right in the center in her sealskin jacket. And these are some of the robots that we built with our team of women that day. The other thing that we do is we take take young Inuit women, only women, on a mentoring program, and it involves introducing them to the ocean at eye view, which is through snorkeling and scuba diving. So this is a young Inuit woman on the right who has the black gloves with one of the Sedna women who's an investment banker from New York on the right. And we introduce these young women to what lies beneath the waves. And for the women who are really excited, we take it to the next level and train them to become certified open water divers, including dry suit divers and polar divers. And this is our photographer in the pool who's taking photographs with an instructor, and two of our young Inuit women learning how to scuba dive in Toronto. They later went on to do their open water dives in the St. Lawrence River, and then joined us as full team members 2 years later in Nunavut and Greenland scuba diving in their own territory, which is extremely impactful for them. So back to this map, I'm not sure that we're ever going to snorkel the Northwest Passage, because when I speak to the women about what has resonated with them, what has been the most impactful thing for them when they explore the Arctic, and these are university professors, submersible pilots, archaeologists, marine biologists, geologists, geophysicists, artists, movie makers, underwater photographers. They all say that working in community with women and girls specifically, but with all the children, is the most gratifying part of these expeditions to the Arctic. And that we are working with these young women to inspire them, to equip them and empower them with the skills and tools that they need to tackle climate change, which is happening in real time in their backyard. And I use the term ocean change a lot because our expedition takes place in the ocean. We are ocean photographers, ocean scientists, and a lot of these young Inuit don't know that these careers exist and that they could do them in their own territory. So we're equipping them with skills and new ideas and new knowledge. And as I said, Team Sedna definitely is becoming so enriched by its experiences with Inuit youth, girls, and elders. And it's a two-way exchange of information, of knowledge, and it's based on mutual respect. And it's been 7 years in the making here in terms of developing these relationships with Inuit individuals and communities. And we continue, and we're becoming more circumpolar in our outlook, and we have Sami reindeer herders and Sami coastal women in our team now. So just imagine when the Sami women come with us to Nunavut on our next expedition, what the conversations are going to be like when we have Inuit and we have Sami all speaking about climate change and ocean change and what's happening in their Arctic environment. And in closing, I just moved to the Arctic 2 weeks ago. I am now living in Iqaluit in Nunavut, which is the capital. And the bandwidth is probably not very good here for internet. So that may be why my words aren't matching my mouth as I'm talking, but it's truly exciting to be in the Arctic and living here right now. It is the only part of Canada that has not had a COVID-19 outbreak because of quarantine happening in the south. I'm living in probably one of the only parts of the world that does not have COVID-19. Anyhow, I'd like to thank Victoria for this opportunity to speak, and back to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to all of our presenters. While the 5 women you heard from in our session today covered many of the histories and current initiatives of women in Arctic and Antarctic sciences, we've only scratched the surface. There are so many more stories, past and present, to illuminate the contribution of women at the poles. In January 2021, the women and organizations behind this panel are organizing a 6-month webinar series to expand the conversation and bring more voices to our table. We hope you'll join us in January to uncover lesser-known stories of women in polar science, recognize and uplift Indigenous women's oral histories and traditional knowledge as fundamental components of scientific research, and join the conversation on systemic change in polar sciences to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. To learn more and register for upcoming webinars, visit www.thearcticinstitute.org and click on the Events tab. We are so excited to share a stellar lineup of scholars, traditional and Indigenous knowledge holders, educators, activists, youth leaders, artists, diplomats, and more in 2021. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you in January.
What a thought-provoking and inclusive discussion. Thank you. Up next is a lightning talk focusing on African American heritage on the Chesapeake Bay and the promotion, integration, and sustainability of minority women in the aquaculture industry. I'm proud to introduce Imani Black, an oyster farmer and founder of Minorities in Aquaculture.
Hi, my name is Imani Black. And today I will be talking about the African American heritage on the Chesapeake Bay and the promotion, integration, and sustainability of minority women in the aquaculture industry. So first, I just want to talk a little bit about myself and how I connect to this topic in general. So first off, I grew up on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, a coastal community that is prevalent on the Chesapeake Bay. I grew up with traditional seafood recipes, boating, fishing, really loving the waters around me, and really being influenced further in my further education of really wanting to be a part of the restoration and conservation efforts of my coastal community. I went to Old Dominion University and graduated with a marine biology degree. And I always knew I wanted to work and do something as a career with restoration and conservation. At first, I looked into doing tropical biology, but realized that research and academia wasn't something that I wanted to pursue at the time. And luckily, that same summer, I had an internship with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's Virginia Oyster Restoration team, where then I solidified and developed a full career in wanting to pursue a career in restoration and conservation of shellfish. After that experience, I then went to Virginia Institute of Marine Science for their oyster aquaculture training program. And that was my first real introduction to the aquaculture industry commercially. There, at that internship, I learned about the hatchery process to nursery to farm to table. And I really started to understand how the aquaculture industry could be really important and is really important to the Chesapeake Bay. So then I decided that I wanted to have a career in aquaculture. So for the last 5 years, I've been working in Maryland and Virginia in their aquaculture industry, working at hatcheries and oyster farms. So as my career developed and as my love and passion developed for the aquaculture industry, I really started to dive into the history of our coastal communities in the Chesapeake Bay. And I was really surprised to find that African Americans and minorities in general have a huge history and huge footprint in the evolution of the Chesapeake Bay. And I realized and I researched that there are thousands, if not millions, untold stories of African Americans as watermen on the Chesapeake Bay. So then I started to do a little research, and I found that most of the stories that we know about African American watermen only are about 20% from firsthand accounts of African American watermen, and the rest are secondhand accounts from slave owners and other historians over the years. But during my research, I found that a gentleman named Paul Cuffey and Frederick Douglass from the Eastern Shore of Maryland are the two prominent gentlemen that have really written about their experiences as being watermen on the Chesapeake Bay. And as we all know, Frederick Douglass used the waterways to disguise himself as a sailor to escape from slavery. So his knowledge and his growing up on the Eastern Shore helped him to benefit his entire life and really helped shape the history of our nation. So then as time goes on, I read about the last skipjack on the Chesapeake Bay today, Kermit Travers. And he has really paved the way for African Americans on the Chesapeake Bay, along with Vincent O'Leggett, who is a 40-year time of being a historian of these untold stories of African Americans. And his agenda with his nonprofit, Blacks of the Chesapeake, is to really push the agenda and to push the conversation of African Americans having a footprint in the evolution of the seafood market of the Chesapeake Bay. So along with these untold stories, I then started to look at my own family, as I knew that I am a thoroughbred of the Eastern Shore. So in my research, I found from census records that my family dates back on the Eastern Shore for over 200 years, ranging from Rock Crawl, Crisfield to Cambridge. Most of my ancestors were watermen during that time, from crabs to oysters to fish, and working into these crab houses and as oyster shuckers. It was proud for me to read that my own family had some sort of footprint in the evolution of all of these untold stories as African American watermen did on the Chesapeake Bay. So during that time, it really helped me connect to what I wanted to do and my passion for the aquaculture industry, and realizing that the aquaculture industry might not be as diverse and inclusive as it should be, as our environment industry should be. I believe that if we love the environment and we say that it's important to conserve it, then it's also important for us to want to engage and encourage everyone to get into the aquaculture and environmental industries. So oysters. Shellfish aquaculture is so important to our coastal communities. Our oyster population is one of our most important keystone species in the Chesapeake Bay. And over the last century, we are down to less than 1% of our historical numbers. And because of that, the reason why we are towards those low numbers is because of four main factors of oyster decline: overfishing, habitat destruction, water quality, and disease like MSX and dermo. Those things have really impacted the population of our Chesapeake Bay, ranging from watermen pulling in 2 million bushels of oysters a day to 200,000 now in present day. And really understanding how our environment and our Chesapeake Bay will change without the presence of these keystone species. Which brings me to my point. Shellfish aquaculture is one of the most sustainable ways of restoring our coastal communities. And as history has gone on in the aquaculture industry, it has been the industry's goal to produce oysters that could go beyond natural reproduction, to present the natural resource with a sterile oyster that not only focuses on their energy, on meat content, flavor, and structure for a good half-shell market, but also to put out oysters, millions of oysters throughout a season, to help with this decline of our Chesapeake Bay health and the oyster population. So what is aquaculture in general? In layman's terms, aquaculture is the production of an aquatic organism in a controlled environment through breeding and rearing and harvesting. So the shellfish aquaculture industry goes from hatchery to nursery to farm. And during all of those processes, it is very hands-on with producing a very quality oyster that will then go into the half-shell market or shucking market or seafood market in general. So aquaculture aims to create the production of our commercial seafood, and then in those efforts, help restore the natural habitats in our natural waters of the Chesapeake Bay, while replenishing and rebuilding our keystone species. So again, the more people that get into aquaculture, shellfish aquaculture, it is so important for our Chesapeake Bay history and our Chesapeake Bay overall water health. So why is aquaculture important? Again, and I say this multiple times because I want this to be a very clear point. Aquaculture is the most sustainable resource for coastal communities. To give you a little bit of numbers behind that, 84% of our seafood in the United States is imported. So 20% of that resource is produced from aquaculture. And almost 50% of the seafood consumed globally is from aquaculture. So as you can see, not only locally, but globally, aquaculture is becoming a huge and sustainable industry and resource for all people all around the world. But specifically shellfish aquaculture is being considered now as one of the most ecological, sustainable means of aquaculture production. And we have it right here in our backyard on the Chesapeake Bay. So again, it is our mission. It is my mission, along with my passion to pursue a career in the aquaculture industry, to create a safe and inclusive environment for women that look like me that want to pursue the aquaculture industry. So that brings me to my other point. Because of this, and during this time, I have created a nonprofit called Minorities in Aquaculture. Basically, this nonprofit came to me in a vision for a diverse and inclusive aquaculture industry. As I've expressed before, the aquaculture industry to our coastal communities is one of the most sustainable resources. And like I said before, if we care about the environment, then we should be trying to push and encourage all types of people that are affected by the seafood resource to want to contribute to it as much as we can. So Minorities in Aquaculture is a nonprofit that aims to create hands-on science programs, mentorships, internships, and opportunities for minority women that want to pursue a successful career in the aquaculture industry. I want to be able to connect them with people of all aspects of aquaculture, to give them the resources so that they can know that the aquaculture industry in general, as a whole, is something that is really important to get into, and that will be important for the impact of our health of the Chesapeake Bay. So like I said, I want to educate, expose, mentor, and develop, but most importantly, empower minority women. Women in general in the aquaculture industry are minority. And because I am an African-American waterman, I feel that it is my duty to go beyond and to reach the next generation of African-American women that look like me to pursue something that could have a huge impact on our seafood resource, locally and globally. So I want to create a safe space for them to feel empowered and seen and to be educated and exposed to things that they haven't necessarily, maybe had never been exposed to. I understand that living in a coastal community, I've had the privilege of really loving and understanding how important it is that we keep our coastal communities clean and healthy. And now I just want to pass on that knowledge to the next generation. And I'm so happy that I've had a welcoming opening to my nonprofit, a welcoming launch. I'm just so grateful to have partnerships developing with the Smithsonian, with the Choose Clean Water Coalition, with the Northeast Fisheries Science Center through NOAA, to help create these hands-on science programs that will really give kids, minority women especially, the opportunity to create a footprint in the aquaculture industry as it's rapidly growing. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you listening, and I encourage you to go check out our website, www.mianpo.org, and really understand and research what we're trying to do. And I just really appreciate all your support so far and after this point. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, Imani, for that powerful talk. Our final panel of the day focuses on ecological meaning-making with a lively discussion moderated by Healoha Johnston, curator of Asian Pacific American Women's Cultural History at the Smithsonian's Asian Pacific American Center. This session will be followed by a Q&A with our panelists, so please submit your questions in the box below the video. Healoha, take it away.
Thank you, Erin. It is my pleasure to join in conversation today with Malia Kutagawa and Sonnet Coggins. Malia is an associate professor with the University of Hawaii Kamakaku-Okolani Center for Hawaiian Studies and the William S. Richardson School of Law. Sonnet is the executive director of the Merwin Conservancy in Haiku, Maui. Our discussion considers how different approaches can work in concert and can be braided together to develop a fuller picture of the human-land relationship. At a time when caring for our ecosystems and for Earth itself encounters a crisis point, we are looking to a successful model that integrates ecological observation and inquiry methods as forms of scientific knowledge that have broader relevance across disciplines and diverse ways of knowing. These methods are already gaining strong footholds in land management policy and aina-based practices, land-based practices in Hawaii. We embrace the Aha Kiole decision-making matrix in this presentation to propose a method for weaving together multiple systems within the social ecological framework, with consideration towards the cultural sector. Malia, can I ask you to start off the discussion by first describing the Aha Kiole decision-making matrix, please?
Mahalo he aloha. One of the roles that I play on my island, Molokai, is that of po'o, or lead of the Aha Kiole o Molokai, an indigenous decision-making body whose purpose is to work collaboratively with government entities to malama aina, to care for our ecosystems and our culture. We have adopted the decision-making process of our ancient kupuna, our ancestors, who founded the original people's councils, weaving their expertise as cultural practitioners to achieve Aina Momona, an abundant land and thriving people. The Aha Kiole decision-making matrix includes approaching a present issue or problem by looking at current needs, looking to ancestral knowledge and wisdom to guide our deliberations, and keeping in mind that decisions we make must ensure an abundant future for those generations that are not yet born. Our decisions also necessitate that we account for impacts to 8 different resource realms and ensure that their integrity is not compromised. The realms are as follows. Moana Nuia Kea, which is from the highest vantage point on the land and looking out towards the sea at its horizon. Kahakai Pepeao, where the sea meets the land, the intertidal zone and coastal strand, up until the sand ends and the soil begins, and all the biota therein. Mauuka, where the soil begins all the way to the mountain tops. Namuliwai, all the sources of fresh water, groundwater, rivers, streams, springs, including coastal springs that feed rich estuaries. Kalevalani, everything in the sky, the birds, the clouds, rainbows, the atmosphere, celestial bodies such as the sun, the moon, the planets, and stars that affect our earth and all life and reproductive cycles. Kanaka Honua, the abode of the people, where we live, farm, work, and raise our families. However, the resources therein are valued for their intrinsic worth, not in the way that they sustain people. Papahe Lolona is knowledge, or ike, in and of itself, as a valued resource that must be treated respectfully, held and propagated responsibly. It is the knowledge of the kahuna, our priests, our kumuhula, those who are expert in the dance, astronomers, healers, and other masters. And finally, ke'ihi'i, which speaks to acknowledging and upholding our vahikapu, our sacred places and spaces, observing the protocols and ceremonies that maintain their sanctity and ensures reciprocity. Our ancient ancestors, their skilled and wise cultural practitioners, possessed an intimate, localized place-based knowledge. They divided the lands into moku, or districts, and further divided the lands into ahupua'a, whose names are known today by the families who retain a great and loved great love and affinity to their onehanau, the sands of their birth. It was the wise leadership of the ancient Ahakiole that manifested abundance in our resources and brought about peaceful relations among the people. It is the ethics and practices of our ancient Ahakiole that we seek to apply today. As an example of this work, I would like to point to the work of Uncle Mac Poi Poi, a modern day konohiki or Aina steward, land steward, of the important Mo'omomi fishery on the northwest coast of Molokai that has sustained the native Hawaiian homesteaders for many generations. I learned of the way Uncle Mac cares for opihi grounds. Opihi is a limpet, a type of mollusk and favorite delicacy of our people. It has been over-harvested on every island except Molokai. Rather than managed from a conventional conservation approach, which has as its underlying philosophy the notion that humans are a pestilence on the earth and must stay away from pristine environments in order for them to recover, Uncle Max sees management in a biocultural context, which is founded upon the Kumulipo, our origin and creation story, which tells us that we are ohana, we are a family to all forms of life. We are nature. There's no separation, no false dichotomy of man and nature, no man versus nature. It is the essence of our understanding of Aina as a mother, us as her children. In fact, Aina is defined as one's feeder, and we identify ourselves by our Aina. From this standpoint, Uncle manages and rotates gathering along our opihi grounds. It is similar to pruning a tree, where human interaction enhances and makes the tree strong and fruitful. Traditional subsistence gathering and sustainably rotating opihi grounds ensure that opihi populations aren't matured out, but that abundance is represented at all generations of opihi, that the gene pool is diverse. This creates greater resistance to disease and resilience in the midst of disturbance events. It ensures that our pilina, our relationship to place, our ono, our yearning and taste for our traditional foods remain, and that our children will build upon a legacy we have left for them.
Thank you, Malia. Sana, do you want to pick up on some of the threads that Malia has introduced and consider how you are thinking through those aspects as you lead Merwin Conservancy?
Thank you, Malia. Your work really exemplifies the regenerative change that occurs when we apply knowledge of our ancestors to the needs of the present and the future. In moving beyond many existing structures for understanding resource management practices to a more capacious socio-ecological framework, I find an invitation, perhaps even an exhortation to all of us, no matter field or discipline, to see ourselves in the critical work of caring for our ecosystems. So thank you for this opportunity to use this framework to think about my responsibility on an organizational level at a moment of great change within the nascent organization that I lead, and of course within the world. The Merwin Conservancy was founded by U.S. Poet Laureate and Pulitzer Prize winning poet, ecologist, and activist W.S. Merwin, who died last year. The Conservancy stewards his legacy, one grounded in ecological, ethical, and literary commitments and a deep connection to place. And it also stewards the 18-acre palm garden he made in this place over a 4 decades-long reciprocal relationship with the land he came to steward for a time. In the late 1970s, Merwin began a daily practice of regenerating land that had been decimated by decades of clear-cutting and failed industrial farming practices. His initial intent was to participate in the restoration of a native forest. During the early years of reviving the soil, Merwin noticed that the native palms, the lo'ulu or Pruchardia, were the only plants that would grow. He followed his curiosity about palms as a keystone species in tropical ecosystems the world over, and today the garden features 2,700 palms, most of them hand-planted by Merwin himself, featuring more than 400 taxonomic species and 125 unique genera, with nearly 900 different horticultural varieties. The collection includes all but 2 to 3 of the native Prochardia, including some on the IUCN Red List. Many of the palms are endangered and some critically endangered, and some have been used as specimen types for newly described species. Earlier this year, the Conservancy became the stewards of this garden and the home within it. At this pivotal moment, we are making decisions as to just how we will hold this place in common and how we will articulate through our programs and partnerships its potential resonance, not only in terms of its botanical diversity, but also as a living, thriving expression of the imagination. Certainly, the Ahakiole framework Malia describes and actively participates in has enriched and expanded my perspective at this pivotal moment, and I'd like to share just a few thoughts about how it has deepened my thinking about the future of the Merwin Conservancy. The process Malia describes is inherently holistic. It embraces the dynamics of overlapping ecosystems, and as illustrated in the anecdote she shared about the opihi, recognizes that humans are an integral part of the ecosystem. The decision-making approach of the Ahakiole also activates multiple forms of knowledge across realms, weaving together and drawing upon multiple knowledge resources to address a question or issue. I have often been asked as we move into this new chapter of our organizational life, of course with finite resources in challenging times that demand careful alignment with clearly defined goals, how are you going to address what is in effect a dual mission, one botanical, the other artistic? Of course, this distinction is false, and it fails to recognize the richness that comes from approaching a multifaceted and evolving system from only one vantage point. I think of a story that Robin Wall Kimmerer recounts in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. The answer, or answers to her question, why do asters and goldenrods look so beautiful together, comes from art and the color wheel, and from science and specialized receptor cells in both humans and bees. As she says, it's a testable hypothesis. It is a question of science, a question of art, and a question of beauty. The Palm Garden itself was a creative act born as much of a passion for botany as it was for art and poetry. And in fact, Merwin was impatient when asked about whether there was a connection between his poetry and his gardening. The human capacity to imagine, he said, was their common root system. This capacity to imagine and to enact what is imagined is at the heart of the programs we are developing. In this place, soon to be held in common in ways that balance public access with mindful land stewardship, we will cultivate the conditions of attention and stillness as the root system of wonder, which in turn is the driver of inquiry that can find expression within disciplines or in ways that defy them. I imagine the Merwin's house in the heart of the palm forest as the site of a multidisciplinary or perhaps anti-disciplinary residency through which scientists, artists, designers, policymakers challenge us to see possibilities of our world from a more capacious standpoint. I imagine a curriculum, again, rooted in observation, stillness, and focused attention that engages young people in developing place literacy and in learning about and through the Native Hawaiian practice of kilo. I hope these initiatives will join many others across sectors as we contribute to a common goal of ecological health and abundance.
Thank you, Sana and Malia. I would like to extend these considerations into the context of a gallery to see how artists and curators can engage in the process of honoring the ancestors while extending and evolving ecological knowledge for the future through material, form, and content by thinking on a few exhibitions as examples. And I'll start with this first example. Mixed media artist Miley Andrade transformed a 1,500 square foot gallery using Velke, mulberry bark, as her primary material in a 2018 solo exhibition titled Miley Andrade, Kawapua Ahina. Andrade's studio practice is informed by her time spent researching and reactivating the kapa making process. A Hawaiian customary textile of pounded vauke, tree bark, kapa was methodically stretched, sometimes decorated, and often layered to function as garments, wraps, and blankets before the introduction of cotton fabrics. In the 19th century, kapa production waned as the native Hawaiian population drastically decreased. However, a cultural resurgence during the 1970s Hawaiian Renaissance reinvigorated ancient practices such as ocean navigation by the stars, hula, oli, and mele. Kapa making, weaving, and growing and gathering of organic materials surfaced as important artistic pursuits and an important contribution to the continuation of Hawaiian land practices. In 1981, Andrade joined the contemporary artists and practitioners who took up the production of Hawaiian material culture, using customary methods as an extension of the Hawaiian Renaissance. Andrade channeled the material and methods of kapa into an immersive installation as she reimagined the elemental manifestations of Hina. A divine kapa maker, the goddess Hina, produced such fine kapa that the clouds in the sky were considered as examples of her work. They were described as examples of her work. Andrade's gallery installation concentrates on the idea that, like Hina, we have the ability to affect change within our environment. Ka'opua Hina features vauke pounded by the artist to the mo'omo'o phase. That is, the material has undergone preliminary rounds of soaking, felting, and drying, priming it for handling, yet keeping it flexible enough to continue into the later stages of kapa production post-exhibition. Resourceful and sustainable, Andrade's practice merges 21st century contemporary art priorities with the radical possibilities of Hawaiian material culture. Kapa dating to the 18th and 19th centuries from the collection of the Honolulu Museum of Art were on view in adjacent galleries. Together with Andrade's installation, these textiles span a period of 200 years and indicate a continuity and evolutionary use of vauke as a sustainable and artful practice that weaves together requisite ecological knowledge, multi-use and biodegradable materials, and contemporary art. Abigail Romachek makes visible the unseen aspects of the Hawaiian environment. Her large-scale installations have focused on seismic activity of volcanic movement, and in this piece, titled Kahea, the sound of bird calls using endemic and native Hawaiian bird spectrograms as her source material. Each of these projects lean into aspects of a living, breathing land, the perception and understanding of which calls for specialized knowledge and close observation of the natural world, with the purpose of drawing attention to subtle movements and sounds within the environment. Molokai Window is an exhibition initiated by social practice artist James Jack in collaboration with community members of Molokai, featuring primarily drawings made of dirt, such as this one that you see here. The dirt was borrowed and then returned to the earth once the show closed. The exhibition foregrounds connections between the people of Molokai to the rhythms of the universe, as understood through customary ecological knowledge. The exhibition considered abundance, sustainable land use practices, resource access initiatives, and contemporary kapu systems enacted by community leaders to regenerate depleting resources. Grassroots efforts led by people who are in many cases subsistence farmers and fishers, respected elders, and great thinkers and doers. Molokai Window underscores the importance of the indivisible relationship between the dirt and the person, where the dirt almost serves as a stand-in for the community members who contributed to the project and signals the many histories tied to Molokai. All three of these artists and their projects do not focus necessarily on the reclamation of identity, but embrace Hawaiian knowledge as a framework to consider global issues, sustainability, ecological health, spirituality, and economic autonomy, with the idea that Hawaii's knowledge systems offer deep insights on inquiry methods as well as the human condition. Malia, I'd like to invite you to share some closing thoughts, if you would.
Aloha, aloha. As women working in a range of ways in the cultural sector, each of us seeks to apply ecological knowledge into the broader cultural landscape animating and enriching it with multiple ways of knowing woven together. As we return to our origins, the Kumulipo, our creation story, we understand that creation continues to unfurl. As we stand in our mana, in our power, come together to bring our ike, our knowledge and expertise, to bear upon the issues we face today. It is together that we weave this aha, this strong cordage. Together we continue to haku, to compose the mele, the songs of creation, with purpose and intentionality. Mahalo.
Thank you, Sonnet and Malia, for sharing in this conversation, and thank you to all of us, all of you who joined us in this discussion. We look forward to engaging in a fruitful Q&A. Thank you, Malia and Sonnet. I would like to start off the Q&A portion by offering a question of my own, if I may. And I'd like to ask Sonnet, I know that you've had on your mind very recently how you go about reconciling some of the terminologies that are used within standard conservation practices, including the very name of your own organization, Conservancy, and how you're thinking about that along with some of the evolving practices that are coming out through not only the Aha Kiole methods, but other practices that are becoming more and more considered to be best practices as Native Hawaiians are more integrated and taking leadership roles within ecological systems in Hawaii.
Yeah, thank you, Aloha. That's a really thoughtful and I think a really great conversation to kick off our Q&A. And it's, as you said, it's the subject of a lot of thinking, and one that I hope even to explore in this nascent network of knowledge and expertise that you've created in this group with our partnership, He Aloha Malia and you, Malia, and I. It's a question that, especially in the realm of language, given that I'm working in a place that stewards the legacy of someone who was so attentive to language as a poet and as a speaker of many languages, a Hawaiian among them, and translation as a practice. I'm thinking a lot about language in general. And this notion, this word of conservation stems from an impulse to keep that land that William came to steward, initially 3 acres, and then over time, the acres around it to equal 18, safe from the development that was coming into this undeveloped area. So in that sense, conserve. And I was always struck by something that William said, that even within his lifetime, he almost saw the evolution of a garden being a notion of controlling an area against a wilderness beyond, to one that was actually holding place for wilderness in a place where so much was being developed around, where the wilderness was disappearing. So that is sort of the notion of where that came from. But you're right, there's an inherent paradox of doing that, of that practice and calling it such in a place where humans are recognized to not only be integral aspects of an ecosystem, but to be the land, to be genealogically related to the land. And so this is a very, very rich question, and open, I think, really productive tension that I'm looking forward to diving into through our interpretive planning process we're doing now, through a lot of studies of place and working to understand the history of the Ahupua'a well before westernized notions of land ownership and understanding were imposed upon it. So thank you for that really excellent question. It's a question that could very well run through the process of the Aha Kiole decision-making matrix to really have a full consideration of all the aspects.
Thank you, Sonnet. Malia, with your experience within the Aha Kiole system, how do you see the evolution of these terms and these relationships functioning? Because the terminology is one thing, but really it's, I think, it's essential for the relationships and the understanding of the relationship between people and land to evolve in order for all of a sudden then there to be these shifts within people's understandings and vocabularies. And you've been doing this now, this kind of work for so long, and I'm wondering what sort of evolutions you've seen and where you think we are headed in terms of social ecological frameworks and the inclusion and leadership of Native Hawaiian philosophies within disciplines related to science.
Well, I think, as I, interact with scientists as a professor, a lot of them come from sort of this capitalism model where we should care about the environment because of the ecological or ecosystem services that elements of nature provide. So they sort of quantify it um, by, kind of a cost benefit sort of analysis. And I find that to be a bit limiting, even though it is perhaps a step in the right direction, um, to at least value nature. But I think, with respect to the Ahakiole, um, elements of nature are valued for their intrinsic worth, and when there is no separation between humans and nature, um, the way that you govern yourself and the way that you look at so-called resources, is from a totally different lens and perspective. Um, so I think as we deal with issues like climate change, as we deal with so many uncertainties, and as we reflect on our impact upon this earth, um, to follow that decision making matrix and to see the realms in this way, the resource realms, what it does is it aligns us better to our planet, and I think it has a potential to create, seismic change if we see from this lens. So what I do is I'll query my students and I'll say that, okay, you're the Ahakiole, and I have this great patent for plastic. And I think it'll be of extreme benefit to the present generations because I can do so many things with plastic, like make Ziploc bags and shopping bags and these sort of things. So I make them analyze according to the realms, and then they begin to realize that it has the use of plastic has so much repercussions along those realms, and it doesn't do anything to protect future generations. They inherit a world that is less beautiful and a world that is depleted if we go down this route. And then I take them through, um, then I take them another route looking at fish ponds. And, these are traditional fish ponds along the shoreline. And it was basically constructed to limit our impact on the reef and open ocean. And so I take them through the different realms, resource realms, and show them how this um, how it benefits all realms and that it provides for future generations. So if we have that understanding, then we will make better decisions. If we don't see that kind of false dichotomy of humans and nature being separate, um, then we'll be able to ask more empowering questions. We'll be able to honor this earth that is sacred, and align our lives in accordance to its natural laws. So
Thank you. And I love to hear that there's a new generation of students who are being introduced to the Ahakiole and who are actually tasked with applying it in their life and in the real world. That's really exciting. One of the things you mentioned, though, Malia, was being able to ask questions, tougher questions, better questions, more empowering ones. And I think that's one of the things that really inspired me about the work that you and Sonnet are both doing, is the focus on inquiry for the sake of empowering, and not only empowering people who live, you know, in Hawaii, but of course, people all around the world, and then empowering the land also, right? And thinking about the necessary step in kind of learning to listen to the land in a very real way, and by asking the questions that will help us hear it. And Sonnet, in the work that you're doing, I'm wondering if that's an aspect of your approach when you think about the connection between, or the intersections between, science and art, is how the listening could be, you know, is that something you train someone to do, or how does that play a role in the residency that you kind of described, you know, with the listening and the careful attention?
We're thinking a lot about the place itself is born of a desire to cultivate a stillness and a focused attention. And it is the energy that is held in that place now. So, you know, we're thinking a lot about how we keep that sort of, how we cultivate the conditions for that, because that seems to be what underlies the sort of the observations, the tiny observations that then scale to broader insights. The time in a time when we have very little time for these kinds of practices, we're looking to really safeguard those as part of the environment that we offer, whether that's full-time residencies or maybe even just a couple of day-long think sessions with groups like this one, to be grappling with the problem and really immersing ourselves in those inquiries. And things like, even we don't have internet connected to the garden, and we plan to keep it that way, to really make sure that our focus is on the very underlying aspects of being engaged with our land through focused attention and stillness.
That's something that I can definitely relate to and appreciate. I think, you know, one of the interesting questions that has come up in the planning of this session in particular is, you know, what is the relationship between the humanities and the sciences? And I think you both, Malia and Sonnet, have articulated that, in fact, they're interwoven just like everything else. And it's made all the more visible where we are in the Pacific, all three of us being based in the Pacific, because issues of climate change and Aina-based practices, the land-based practices, are so urgent, right? It's not, so we can't sort of relegate the most pressing questions of our time and place to particular disciplines, but rather the conversation really has to broaden for all of us to see ourselves in it, given what we're facing here in the Pacific. And so, you know, in these last couple of seconds, I really want to thank both of you for engaging in this conversation. Malia, for, you know, all the work that you're doing with Ahakiole and at the University of Hawaii and in the court systems. You know, your influence is felt in so many different areas. Sonnet, likewise, with what you're doing with Merwin Conservancy, is an example for the way that the arts and the sciences can come together in really meaningful and powerful ways. So thank you.
Mahalo. Aloha.
A huge thank you to all our speakers and panelists, and thank you to all of our viewers for joining us today. We'll be back here tomorrow, same time, same place, for sessions focused on gender equity and inclusion in science. If you pre-registered via Eventbrite for our virtual networking event immediately following this, please use the Zoom link to attend. Thank you and enjoy your evening.
Nora Naranjo Morse is a contemporary Native artist known for her work in ceramics. She won a national design competition that was hosted by the National Museum of the American Indian. Always Becoming is made of natural and non-toxic materials. She wanted the sculptures to evolve and change, sort of like how we do as people. Nora's really drawing on hundreds of years of Pueblo traditional ceramic work in her art. She takes inspiration from her ancestors and applies it in new and different ways. Nora's artwork inspires me because she has a really beautiful way of blending and recognizing traditional Native cultures. From the sculpture pieces outside, you can see the Capitol building. And so it really shows that there's a place for Native people here. And I think it just shows the value that can be placed on this traditional culture and knowledge in the 21st century.